It Walks at Midnight, from the Scariest Stories You've Ever Heard, Part 2, by Katherine, Burt. Mike and Rob loved hiking in the countryside near the college they attended in Kentucky. With their dog Ernie, they had been to most of the state parks in the area. But they were especially excited about the next hike they were going to take. They were going to the fantastic Red River Gorge over spring vacation. "Look at those cliff walls," said Rob on the hike to the gorge. "Awesome," answered Mike. "They're even steeper than I thought they'd be." After hiking for most of the afternoon, then setting up camp, and then fixing dinner, they were pretty tired. Even Ernie, who had been exploring all over, looked beat. They were relaxing around the campfire, looking up at the sky, and listening to the night sounds. The full moon made everything look a little spooky. Mike tossed another log onto the fire. They watched as the sparks floated up into the darkness. Rob reached down to scratch Ernie's ears, but Ernie was gone. "Hey, did you hear Ernie run off?" Rob asked. "No," Mike answered, "but don't worry about it. He'll come back." But just when they heard yelping and whimpering coming from somewhere in the woods, they both recognized Ernie's bark and stood up. Mike grabbed his flashlight, and they walked in the direction of the whimpering. "Here, Ernie. Come here, boy," they called. Soon they heard a rustling sound in the thick underbrush. A minute later, Ernie came bursting out of the bushes and ran towards Mike. The poor dog was trembling all over, and the fur on his back was sticking straight up. "Hey, what's wrong, boy? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ernie just whimpered and hid behind Mike's legs. "Whatever's in there sure did scare Ernie," Rob said. "Maybe it's a bear or wildcat?" Mike shined his flashlight into the dark woods, where Ernie had come running out. The shadow of the trees and all the leaves made several fantastic and eerie shapes. "Look up there," whispered Rob, pointing to a small ledge about 20 feet above the ground. What is it?" Mike whispered. It doesn't look like a bear. It looks more like a huge dog." On the ledge, staring down at them in the moonlight, with eyes that seemed to glow like little points of red fire, stood a large black dog. "Look at the way he's moving his head," Mike said. "Almost like he's trying to tell us something." "Yeah, like, get out of here, and I think that's some good advice," answered Rob. "No, I don't think so," said Mike. "Look at his eyes. I think he wants us to follow him somewhere." "You gotta be joking. That thing looks like a monster." "Now look what it's doing." As Rob and Mike watched, the huge black dog seemed to float up into the air. It floated back up the side of a cliff wall and, with one final piercing stare down at them, turned and disappeared without a sound. A minute later, they heard a blood-curdling howl from somewhere off in the distance. It sounded half-human, almost like a person crying in agony. They could barely sleep that night, and the next morning they went to the ranger station to report what they had seen. The ranger sighed. "I'll be honest with you, boys," he said. "You aren't the first ones to report seeing that dog, or whatever it is. The stories are pretty much always the same, and it's always people camping in that area. I honestly expected someone to report it today." "Why today?" Mike asked. "Because last night was a full moon," the ranger answered. "The creature only seems to appear on the night of the full moon. Then it just disappears." "Do you know what it is?" Rob asked. "No idea. It could be a dog that's gone wild, or a wolf or a bear that people didn't get a good look at. Or," the ranger paused, "could be a ghost." "But," Mike said, "I know. I don't believe in ghosts either, the ranger said. But when you're out in the gorge alone on a moonlit night, you start thinking about all the stories and legends you heard. Sometimes you start to think that anything could happen there. Mike and Rob thought of the unearthly howl and the dog's piercing, fiery eyes. Maybe the ranger was right. Anything could happen in there. They were turning to leave when Mike remembered something. Did any of the others report that the dog seemed to be telling them something, he asked. The ranger gave them a serious look. As a matter of fact, another person did notice that the dog seemed to be moving his head in a strange way, like he was trying to point to somewhere. Yeah, that's what he did, Mike said excitedly. That person was me, the ranger said. After I read some of the reports, I decided to try and see the thing myself. After seeing it, I didn't know what to think. Have you checked through old records or reports to see if anybody has lost a dog? Said Rob, who had been quiet for a while. I looked through all the stuff in my office, which goes back 10 years. Anything older than that would be in the district warehouse in Stanford. That's where our college is, said Rob. We could check the old records. That would be great, said the ranger. But that stuff is old and messy. Those records go back into the last century. It'll be a big job. You boys think you can handle it? We'll give it a try, said Mike. It was a busy time at school, and Mike and Rob didn't have much time to search. They finally did get to spend an entire Saturday looking through musty old report files. Farther and farther back in time they went. It was interesting to read about all the different things that people had lost throughout the years. After 6 hours of searching and sneezing from all the dust, they were about to give up. Then Mike held up an old yellowed piece of paper with some faded writing on it. Take a look at this, he said. The report was from June 22nd, 1935. It told of a 10-year-old boy that had been camping in the gorge with his family. He had wandered off on a rainy evening and never came back. The family and park rangers searched for him, but he was never found. Stamped on the back of the paper was a piece of notebook paper. It read, "The family's dog, a black Labrador retriever named Midnight, was also never found." "We have to show this to the park ranger," Rob cried. They arranged for the ranger to drive out in the afternoon of the next full moon. He met them at the door of the ranger station. I checked the almanac for 1935. June 22nd was a full moon. Together, all three of them hiked back into the area where Mike and Rob had seen the dog a month earlier. Ernie seemed nervous to be back in the area where he received such a fright. The sky began to cloud over as the camp set up in the same place as before. "Looks like it could drizzle," said the park ranger. "Starting to look like that day in 1935, said Mike. The report said it was rainy. They sat quietly after dinner, waiting for something they knew might never show up. Mike didn't know which was worse, if the dog never appeared or if it did. Maybe he didn't want to know the dog's strange secret. Maybe it was better to just leave such things alone. The campfire was burning low. Ernie was sleeping at Mike's feet. It hadn't rained, but the fog and mist had descended into the gorge, making them feel more alone than ever. Suddenly, Ernie's ears perked up. He sniffed once or twice, then became stiff with fear. He started to tremble and whimper. Mike petted the frightened dog and said softly, "I think it's here." They all looked up through the mist to the same ledge. There stood the great black dog. The fog made the dog's fiery eyes seem even brighter. Mike tied Ernie's leash to a log and whispered, "Stay here, boy." Slowly, Rob, Mike, and the ranger stood up and walked towards the cliff where the dog stood motionless. Through the mist, they again noticed the way the dog moved its head. When they were as close as they could get to the ledge without climbing, Mike nodded to Rob. Rob took a deep breath and called out through the mist in a voice made hoarse by fear. "Midnight! Midnight! Take us where you want to go. We will follow you." What the dog did next sent chills of terror up the spines of all three men. He turned his blazing eyes directly at them and howled an unearthly howl up at the fog-shrouded full moon. Then he half walked, half floated, part way down the steep cliff wall. When the ranger shined his flashlight towards the dog, they saw there was a small hidden rock path leading up to the face of the cliff. It had been hidden in the mist. "Come on," Rob said. "Midnight is showing us this path." They scrambled up the steep, rocky path. It was a tough going, but they found that the dog had waited for them. On and on the black dog led them, through the thick bushes and underbrush, around wild rock formations, over giant boulders and thick tree roots. Every now and then, the full moon broke through the thick areas and lit up the ghostly forest scene. And always, the dog leading them on, waiting for them, his blazing red eyes leading the way. After 45 minutes, when they were deep into the gorge, in an isolated place where none of them had ever been, Midnight stopped. He waited for them at the bottom of a tall, steep rock cliff. They could barely make out the top of the cliff. It had to be 40 feet up. Midnight stood on a small pile of rocks and dirt, which was overgrown with plants and bushes. In the light of the ranger's lantern shining through the fog, they watched as Midnight moved his head in that odd way again and again. He seemed to be directing them towards the mound of rocks. "That's where he wants us to look," whispered Mike. As if he heard Mike's whisper, the great dog tilted his head back and howled at the full moon, in a way they had never heard a dog howl. The dog had, in its 50 long years of sadness, heartbreak, and lonely wandering, sounded human. As they watched, the dog seemed to slowly float up and away from them. The last thing they saw was the fiery red eyes floating away into the mist. When the dog was gone, Mike held the lantern while the ranger started to clear away the small pile of rocks and bushes where the dog had stood. After a few minutes of digging with a small shovel, the ranger uncovered something small and white. He held it up in the lantern's light. It was a bone. Working quickly, they soon found a small human skeleton, crumpled as if from a fall. The skull had a large crack in it. By touching the human skeleton, there was a skeleton of a huge dog. Around the dog's skeleton was a rotted leather collar that crumbled when Rob picked it up. Attached to the collar was a dog tag. Rob held it with shaking hands as they read the name in the light of the lantern. They heard in the distance the strange, unearthly howl of the ghostly dog that had led them to this spot. The name on the dog tag was Midnight. Mike and Rob loved hiking in the countryside near the college they attended in Kentucky with their dog. Just want to let you guys know what gender the dog was, you know. Hey, did you hear Ernie run off? I can't talk today. Help.